In the Middle East, one of the most dangerous rivalries in the modern world continues to unfold in silence. Two nations, Iran and Israel, locked in a conflict that rarely erupts into open war, but never truly disappears. They do not share a border. They do not fight face to face. And yet, their confrontation stretches across an entire region. But this hostility was not always inevitable. There was a time when Iran and Israel were not enemies. So what changed? How did cooperation turn into a shadow war driven by ideology, power, and the constant risk of escalation? To understand this conflict, we must go back to the moment everything changed. Today, the hostility between Iran and Israel appears deep and almost unbreakable, a rivalry defined by tension, suspicion, and conflict. But it was not always this way. There was a time, not long ago, when these two nations were not enemies. In the decades before 1979, their relationship was shaped not by confrontation, but by quiet cooperation. Under the rule of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran maintained informal yet meaningful ties with Israel. It was not a public alliance, but behind the scenes, connections were real and strategically important. Both nations faced a complex and uncertain Middle East. Surrounded by rival powers and shifting alliances, they found common ground and shared concerns about security and stability. Trade moved quietly between them. Intelligence cooperation developed out of necessity. Interests aligned, not out of friendship, but out of survival. At the same time, Iran's alignment with the United States placed it indirectly within a broader network that included Israel. To the outside world, the relationship remained subtle, almost invisible. There were no grand declarations, no public partnership, but there was also no hostility. For a brief moment in modern history, Iran and Israel existed not as rivals, but as cautious partners navigating the same uncertain region. But beneath the surface, something was beginning to change. Forces were shifting, and within a few years, that quiet cooperation would give way to a far more dangerous reality. In 1979, everything changed, not just for Iran, but for the entire Middle East. A revolution was unfolding, one that would reshape a nation and redefine its place in the world. The Iranian Revolution brought an end to the rule of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah who had governed Iran for decades. In his place emerged a new system, one built not on monarchy, but on revolutionary ideology and religious authority. At the center of this transformation stood Ruhollah Khomeini, a powerful and influential cleric. Khomeini did not simply seek to change Iran's government. He sought to redefine its identity. Under this new leadership, Iran's foreign policy shifted dramatically. The country no longer aligned itself with Western powers. Instead, it positioned itself in direct opposition to external influence, especially from the United States and its allies. And within this new worldview, Israel was no longer seen as a distant state with quiet ties. It was redefined as an enemy. The shift was not just political, it was ideological. Support for Israel became associated with the old order, the monarchy, foreign influence, and a past the revolution sought to erase. Rejecting Israel became part of the identity of the new Iranian state. Diplomatic ties were cut. Cooperation ended. Public rhetoric intensified. Almost overnight, the quiet relationship that once existed disappeared. In its place, something far more powerful began to emerge. A growing hostility, rooted not only in politics, but in fundamentally different visions of power, identity, and the future of the region. And from that moment on, the path toward confrontation was set. As the new leadership in Iran began to consolidate power, the conflict with Israel moved beyond diplomacy. It became something deeper, a clash of ideas. For Iran's revolutionary government, identity was no longer defined by alliances or strategy alone. It was built on resistance. Resistance to foreign influence, resistance to Western power, and support for movements it viewed as oppressed across the region. Within this worldview, opposition to Israel became more than a policy. It became a principle, a defining part of how the new Iranian state saw itself and its role in the Middle East. But on the other side, Israel saw the situation very differently. As a nation surrounded by complex and often hostile environments, survival was not a theory. It was a necessity. Any state that openly opposed its existence was not seen as a distant political rival, but as a direct and immediate threat. And this is where the danger began to grow. On one side, a revolutionary state driven by ideology and a vision to reshape regional power. On the other, a nation focused on security, stability, and defense at all costs. The conflict was no longer about territory. It was no longer about diplomacy. It had become rooted in identity, belief, and perception. And conflicts built on ideology are the hardest to resolve, because they are not just fought over land or power, they are fought over meaning, over purpose, and over the future itself. By the 1980s and 1990s, the confrontation between Iran and Israel began to take on a new and more complex form. The hostility was real. The tension was growing. But there was no direct war, no large-scale battles, no official declarations. Instead, the conflict moved into the shadows. Iran began expanding its influence across the region, building relationships with allied groups and movements that aligned with its strategic and ideological vision. Its reach extended quietly, but steadily. At the same time, Israel intensified its efforts to monitor and counter that influence. Intelligence networks grew. Surveillance deepened. Covert operations became more frequent. Each side was moving carefully, calculating every step, not to start a war, but to gain an advantage. This was the beginning of what would later be known as a shadow war, a conflict not fought with armies on open battlefields, but through hidden actions, strategic alliances, and silent operations. The battlefield was no longer defined by borders. It stretched across countries, across networks, across influence itself. And with every move made in secrecy, the tension grew more unpredictable. Because in a conflict fought in the shadows, there are no clear lines, no clear rules, and no clear moment when peace ends and war truly begins. As the shadow conflict between Iran and Israel deepened, the rivalry began to spread far beyond their borders. This was no longer a hidden struggle between two nations. It was becoming a conflict across an entire region. Unable and unwilling to confront each other directly, both sides turned to indirect methods of power. Iran expanded its reach by supporting allied groups and movements across the Middle East, building networks that extended far beyond its own territory. Through these alliances, influence could be projected without open war. But for Israel, this growing network was not a distant development. It was a direct and immediate concern. The conflict was getting closer, across multiple countries. Opposing forces began to take shape, each aligned, directly or indirectly, with one side of the rivalry. Local tensions intensified. Existing conflicts became more complex. What once appeared as isolated struggles were now part of something much larger. This was no longer a simple dispute between two states. It had become a regional confrontation, a web of alliances, rivalries, and competing interests, all connected to the growing tension between Iran and Israel. And as this web expanded, so did the danger. Because in a conflict spread across many fronts, it only takes one spark to ignite something far greater. As the rivalry between Iran and Israel continued to evolve, one issue rose above all others: Iran's nuclear program. For leaders in Iran, the message was clear. Their nuclear activities, they insisted, were meant for peaceful purposes, energy development, scientific progress, and national advancement. But beyond Iran's borders, that explanation did little to ease growing concern. For Israel, the stakes were far higher. The possibility of a nuclear-armed Iran was not seen as a distant or theoretical risk, but as a direct and existential threat. Because if Iran were to develop nuclear weapons, it could fundamentally reshape the balance of power in the Middle East. And once that balance shifts, it is almost impossible to reverse. This fear began to reshape strategy on all sides. Warnings grew louder. Diplomatic pressure intensified. International negotiations attempted to limit Iran's nuclear ambitions, while sanctions were imposed to slow its progress. But with every passing year, the tension deepened. Because nuclear capability changes everything. It raises the stakes, it shortens the time to react, and it leaves far less room for error. What had once been a shadow conflict was now tied to one of the most dangerous questions in the modern world, and the consequences of getting that answer wrong could be irreversible. In the modern era, the confrontation between Iran and Israel has become more advanced and far more difficult to see. The battlefield is no longer defined by land or borders. It has expanded into cyberspace, intelligence networks, and precision operations carried out far from public view. Cyber attacks strike critical systems without warning. Covert operations disrupt key projects in silence. Highly coordinated actions unfold with precision and with denial. Each side moves carefully, not to start a war, but to weaken the other, step by step. This is a conflict defined by ambiguity. Actions are taken, but rarely claimed. Messages are sent, but seldom spoken aloud. The world sees the consequences, but not always the cause. And yet, despite its hidden nature, the danger is very real. Every operation carries the risk of escalation. Every response risks retaliation. And in a conflict built on secrecy, even a small misunderstanding can spiral into something far more dangerous. The shadow war continues, evolving with technology, strategy, and the shifting balance of power, invisible to many, but shaping the future of the region in ways that may only become clear when it is too late. Today, the rivalry between Iran and Israel stands as one of the most complex and dangerous tensions in global politics. Decades after the events that first divided them, the conflict continues to shape the Middle East and influence decisions far beyond the region itself. But this is no longer a conflict defined by a single moment in history. It has become something else, an evolving struggle, one that adapts to new technologies, new strategies, and new realities. At its core, this rivalry is driven by competing visions of power, security, and influence. For Iran, it is a question of resistance and the expansion of its presence across the region. For Israel, it is a matter of survival and maintaining a fragile strategic balance. And for the rest of the world, it is a source of constant uncertainty, because as long as this rivalry continues, the risk of escalation never truly disappears. And in a region already shaped by tension, even a single miscalculation could trigger consequences far beyond its borders. The story is still unfolding, and the final chapter has yet to be written.